Now, G7 foreign ministers came out with a statement on day two of their meeting in Tokyo. The group condemning Hamas and called for humanitarian pauses in the Gaza Strip to get desperately needed aid to the civilian population. The U.S. Secretary of State says Israel should not reoccupy Gaza. The statement comes after Benjamin Netanyahu suggested managing the enclave security indefinitely.
No reoccupation of Gaza. The United States believes key elements should include no forcible displacement of Palestinians from Gaza. Not now, not after the war. No use of Gaza as a platform for terrorism or other violent attacks. No reoccupation of Gaza after the conflict ends. No attempt to blockade or besiege Gaza. No reduction in the territory of Gaza.
We can now bring in Sari Bashi, Program Director at Human Rights Watch and co-founder and former Executive Director at Gisha in the West Bank. Great to have you with us here on France 24. Today we had G7 foreign ministers who came out with a statement calling for humanitarian pauses in Gaza 1 month after this conflict broke out. We've seen 10,500 Palestinians killed, but still no calls for a ceasefire. How does that make you feel?
I'm very concerned that the world, and in particular Western backers of the Israeli government, are not fulfilling their obligations to protect civilians in Gaza. Since this war began, since this escalation began, civilians, Israelis and Palestinians, have paid the price. This began with a horrific attack on Israeli civilians on October 7th, and it's continuing with relentless bombardment of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and also the deliberate blocking of life-saving aid, in particular fuel, to civilians.
And it's not just civilians that have come under attack. We also had humanitarian workers who have been killed over the past month. Yesterday, we had a Red Cross convoy that came under fire. What guarantees are humanitarian workers working in Gaza getting, if anything at all?
The laws of war require warring parties like Israel to take very special protections to protect hospitals, ambulances, humanitarian convoys, the people who are trying to keep Gaza's 2.2 million people alive. We've seen, unfortunately, attacks on hospitals. Human Rights Watch recently documented an apparently unlawful attack on an ambulance in front of Shifa Hospital, where the Israeli military acknowledged dropping a missile on an ambulance, killing about 15 people. The laws of war are very specific about what needs to happen to protect, in particular, facilities. They must be protected at all times, and even if they are being used for military purposes, which is a grave violation of the laws of war, there are still additional protections, including warnings, that need to take place, and that's not what's happening.
Israel keeps saying that Hamas, hides itself amongst the civilian population. How is it that people tend to listen to what Israel has to say when it comes to that, given that we're seeing this huge death toll?
Look, Palestinian fighters, like all fighters, have an obligation to protect civilians by, to the extent possible, avoiding using civilian areas for military purposes. In particular, any use of medical facilities for military purposes would be a grave violation of international humanitarian law. But that's not enough for them to lose their protections. My concern is that the Israeli government is misrepresenting and distorting humanitarian law protections and weaponizing them against civilians. Hospitals must be protected, even if they're being used for military purposes. You have to warn, you have to take extra measures, and you cannot attack them merely because they're being used for military purposes. There are additional protections, specifically because hospitals are so critically important.
Hospitals are important, but hospital staff are working with very little. They have no fuel. They're operating without electricity. They're operating without pain meds. Mothers are having to undergo cesarean operations to deliver their babies without pain medication, amputations without pain medication. At what point is this going too far?
I mean, it's already gone too far. There are reports of thousands of cases of acute respiratory infections, diarrhea, and chickenpox at UNRWA shelters because of the difficulty in maintaining basic sanitation. That's related to the Israeli government's refusal to allow fuel to enter Gaza, life-saving fuel that's needed to pump water, sewage systems, and power hospital generators for neonatal intensive care units and other vital functions. The international community needs to be very clear and specific that willfully impeding relief supplies to a population under bombardment is a war crime. And the Israeli government needs to immediately allow fuel in through the Egyptian crossings, as well as to take measures to open its own crossings for life saving humanitarian relief, as it has done in previous hostilities in Gaza.
Israel keeps saying Hamas has fuel. You mentioned fuel, how it's life saving fuel. Let's talk about the aid that has been coming in. It's into the enclave. What is being included if not fuel?
So, because they're not letting fuel in, it's very difficult to pump and purify drinking water in Gaza. So, they're wasting truck space with bottled water because the Israeli government is not allowing fuel. Some food, sanitation supplies, and medical supplies have come in, but it's extremely difficult to get them to northern Gaza, where Gaza's main hospital, Shifa Hospital, is located. And that's of grave concern because civilians in northern Gaza are under constant bombardment. And Shifa Hospital is the only hospital in Gaza that can cope with some of the very complex injuries that the more than 20,000 injured people are presenting. The fuel is life-saving. The Israeli government has the authority under the laws of war to inspect shipments coming in via Egypt, to monitor the fuel to prevent diversion. They cannot deny civilians in Gaza life-saving fuel that they need in order to survive.
Israel does warn that it's notifying residents of Gaza before it does carry out a strike, even though they are cutting electricity and network connections. So it's unsure how the civilian population is being warned. I want to ask you about the future generation, because Israel says its goal is to get rid of Hamas. But what worries me, I see these images of these young children shuddering in shock. And it begs the question, what is the future of Gaza going to look like when you creating a population that's going to be so disenchanted?
I mean, already the Israeli military destroyed or damaged nearly half of the housing units in Gaza. So rebuilding is going to be quite difficult. The lives lost, the more than 4,000 children killed in the last month, cannot be rebuilt. There's nothing that can be done. What can be done right now is to immediately require the Israeli military to abide by the laws of war protection for civilians. And then, once the fighting stops, to start looking at the root causes of this violence. This didn't happen in a vacuum. More than 70% of people living in Gaza are refugees from what is now Israel. They have not been allowed back for the last 75 years. That's one of the root causes of this. The Israeli military, for the last few decades, has been carrying out, committing crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution.
Indeed,
Putting
and sorry, while we're talking about this, of course, we're talking about what's going on in Gaza, but we have to also mention what's going on in the West Bank. We have seen that uptick in in attacks, settler attacks, army raids to the population there who are being driven from their homes.
And it's part of a policy to ensure Jewish demographic supremacy in most of the lands, what's mandatory in Palestine. So the Israeli government has pushed Palestinians into Gaza, not let the refugees there return to their homes in what is now Israel, and in the West Bank engaged in more direct forcible transfer by removing Palestinians from their lands in order to make more room for Jewish settlements, which are unlawful under international law. So this didn't come from a vacuum. The escalation that began on October 7th began with horrific war crimes by Palestinian fighters. Nothing justifies them. But we also need to understand that there are root causes to the and if we want a better future for Israelis, for Palestinians, we need to start addressing them, starting with the apartheid.
Indeed. Sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for that, Sari Bashi, joining us there.